Okay, so this is the Bible study for 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. And it says, the Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said, Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, this man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing. He had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel and delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your household, I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. And we're going to stop there in verse 14. I know the story continues, but there's a lot of meat here to chew on. And so we're going to take another week to look at the rest of this chapter. Number one, remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive, so you can follow along with us. And number one says, what happened in our last Bible study in 2 Samuel 11, which was really the beginning of this story. And if you missed out on that, then you don't know what Nathan is talking about. And so I would really highly recommend you look back and at least read that text, if not study the Bible study with us and watch the video that's available so that you're not lost as we dive into this. But number one gives it in a nutshell here. It was spring when kings go off to war, and that seems like a minor piece of the text, but I believe it's pretty significant, and we talked about that quite a bit. B, David was home in bed. C, David took a walk and saw a beautiful woman bathing. That's true. All of this is true. D, David asked about her and found out she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. That's true. E, David sent for her and slept with her and she became pregnant, and astonishingly, that is true. Even after he found out she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, he slept with her. F, David sent for Uriah to create an excuse for him to go home so that maybe he wouldn't get caught when the wife of a soldier who had been away turns up pregnant. Yeah, that was going to be a problem. That was going to be obvious, but maybe Uriah comes home, and maybe that's how it all happened. But G, Uriah didn't go home, but slept on his mat at the gate, and David tried to get him drunk so that hopefully he would go home. That didn't work either, but all this is true. Surprisingly so. It seems hard to believe that somebody would do all this stuff. I mean, we've met people that we probably think would, but we thought David was different. Maybe some of us have done stuff just like this or similar. But man, we just really thought David was the hero in this story. Finally, David sent word to Joab to put Uriah on the front line where he might easily be killed, and then withdraw from him to make sure he is killed. And that all really happened. Number two, what happens in 12:1-4? The Lord sent Nathan to David. So Nathan is a prophet. When a prophet shows up to you, that's usually bad, because the prophet tells the truth, and the prophet usually tells the truth when the truth needs to be told, because in our lives, somehow our lives and our actions have not matched up with what should be in the plan and the will of God. And so the prophet shows up to bring correction, and that truth is correction. So the prophet showed up, and we know this is the first time in quite some time in this book that the prophet has showed up. And so this is probably going to be hard on David here. Nathan told David a story. Of course he did. David did not seem to see why what he had done was wrong, but Nathan instead told him a story where right and wrong seemed very clear to David. See, in Nathan's story, there were two men, one rich and the other poor. The rich man with many cattle, the poor man had nothing except one ewe lamb that was like part of the family. A traveler came to the rich man, but rather than take one of his many sheep or cattle, he took the ewe lamb from the poor man to prepare a meal. This seems crazy. You know, the rich man has plenty to prepare. He has no right to take something from the poor man to begin with. But what's even worse, how terrible is it that he chooses to take something from the poor man that is the only thing that he has, and is beyond just an animal to them, but is a part of the family. And he kills that when he has so much that he could have. So that's like the height of selfishness is what this story is portraying. Somebody who is rich but can't stand to take from his own riches to care for a traveler that came to him, and instead takes from the poverty and what little somebody has that is in poverty, to prepare a meal for this traveler. So like all of us look at this and we say he had plenty, and yet he didn't want to sacrifice anything that he had. Instead, he took everything this other man had. How could he do such a thing? And that's really the response that David had. It says, number three, how did David respond to the story according to 12:5-6? He thought it was fine. Everybody acts like this. Well, too many people do act like this, but David did not think it was fine. He was up to this point had been a person of character and would never think of doing something like this. So he burned with anger. B and C, he declared judgment. He said, this guy should die. And if nothing else, he should at least pay 4 times what that animal was worth, because he took it from him instead of using one of his own. And this isn't something where the cost was just the cost of this lamb. It doesn't make it right for him just to pay for the lamb. He has taken something entirely more valuable, and with no reason, no less. He could have taken something of his own if he hadn't been so selfish. So David clearly sees the problem and declares judgment. And then he said to the man, must pay for the lamb, pay for that lamb 4 times over. And that would be a grace, that would be a mercy to the man, because he thinks the guy should die for the way he acts. My dad had several times to me said that he thought the laws, our culture, our situation in our country would be much, much better if we instituted the death penalty for people who litter. And obviously that was extreme, and he may have been being a little bit hyperbolic. But his point was, to litter is something so selfish, because honestly, to throw a piece of paper on the ground is downright lazy. There's trash cans. and all you're saying is I care so little for everybody around me, our environment, our culture, our community, whatever, that I am not even willing to carry this paper with me until the next time I get to a trash can. Which if it's in my car, I can set a little bag in my car and put trash and then take it into the house. I could, I could, you know, carry it until I get into a building, every house, everybody has trash cans. And I am just so lazy and so selfish that I refuse to even do that. And I think little of so many people around me that was his point. And he thought, that is an attitude that if you're willing to litter, then you're willing to do just about anything because that's how selfish and lazy you are. And that was his point, is if the people that are that lazy and that selfish um, are not allowed to continue on and propagate themselves and all of that, then the selfishness that's required for murder and all of those other things just wouldn't exist, because we're not allowing this selfishness. And it was kind of hyperbolic, but what he was pointing out is how crazy it is that somebody would literally care so little for anybody else and anything outside themselves that the minor effort it takes to get to a trash can is beyond them, and they're willing to sacrifice the good of everybody for that minor good. And he was just sort of always astonished that people like this um, existed. How can people be so selfish? And that's kind of I would say that this story was such that it was even worse than littering. But that was the point, is this person is astonishingly selfish, amazingly so, obviously so. And David said, this guy should not, it doesn't deserve to live. How could he do this? But here's the problem. Obviously, David was the guy. Um, and so he saw the selfishness. And I think really the reason my dad would say that is because he was more interested. He was surprised how few people saw the selfishness in littering, or saw the disregard for humanity and other people in littering. There's so few people saw it that he was trying to point out that this is the problem, that it's this selfishness that is the problem with our world. And it's this selfishness that we need to get rid of in our world. And of course, the Christian response is not really, let's institute the death penalty for all of it, perhaps, but it's, let's remove this selfishness from our lives. That's really what we want to see happen, both ours and the people around us. So anyway, he thought this was a big deal. Now, David, what did Nathan tell David in 12:7 through 10? You are that man. And this was stunning. This was surprising and probably cut deep to the core, because David saw the selfishness in what this other man did in the story, but he didn't see the selfishness in what he did. He was blinded to it. And I would propose that many of us in the church are blinded to the selfishness that we have. We're blinded to the things that we do that show disregard for others, which is why we need pastors, which is why we need that prophet to come to us, because we often do things that seem normal, and we don't understand that we've been blind to this selfishness. In fact, I would say, there's things in the church that we do that I find so important, and then there's people in the church that don't ever have anything to do with them, and they have found reasons why they don't think they need to. And I don't think those people think that they're being selfish. I think those people think that they have reasonable priorities and balance and all of these sorts of things. And I think, man, you're just really sitting home and watching TV, or relaxing while we're doing this ministry that's so vital. Oh, you don't think you need to come to church because you're in church a different day. Well, do you come to church for yourself or for others? Because and the truth is, there should be some of both. We grow when we come together as a church, but so many people think, well, I'm growing, I'm okay. Okay, well, fine. Then don't come for this for your benefit. Come for the benefit of others, because there's new believers that are there that you're not a part of their growth because you're not there. And so I'm just continuously stunned by the selfishness of believers, of Christians, and of people in our church. Yes, also people in our church that don't do things, and they're so obviously needed for the care and the growth of others, but we're not a part of it. I'm just constantly stunned, but we're blind to it. And I'm just telling you, I have to adjust my attitude sometimes and remember that we need to be reminded. We need a Nathan in our life, because we're blinded to some of the selfishness in our own lives that we don't even recognize. And we've thought what we're doing is fine, but it's not fine. Anyway, B, he gave David a message from the Lord, and that's true. C, the Lord gave him all he needed, and if that had been too little, he would have given him more. Think about this. This is amazing. This is part of the message that Nathan gave to David. He said, God said this: I've given you everything. I've given you your master's wives. You've got wives. You didn't need another wife. And if all of that hadn't been enough, I would have given you more. I've been watching over you. I've been caring for you. I've been giving you everything you needed. You had all you needed, and yet you took from someone else because what you had wasn't enough, apparently. And so this is framed in a lack of trust and reliance on God. Not even this idea of how bad adultery is, because I mean, it is one of those thou shalt nots, but it's not even framed like that. When David brings this correction, he said, you had everything, and everything you had, I gave you, and I would have given you more. But instead of trusting in me for provision, instead of thinking what I've given you is enough, or even just asking for more, you took from someone who had very little. How could you do that? D, why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? So you've done something that you know is wrong. And what does that mean? You hate, you despise the word of the Lord, because you knew what God told you to do and you did something else anyway. And then he said, now the sword will never depart from your house. And obviously this is a summary, because he says he brought the sword, and now the sword is there. And he says, I'm going to give your wives to someone close to you, and you slept with this man's wife in secret, but someone close to you is going to sleep with your wives right out in the open in broad daylight in front of everybody, and everybody's going to see it, and you're going to be disgraced. And ultimately, if you've read ahead, we know this happens. And it's all this is a consequence of what David did to someone else, which seems unfathomable. Number 5, why did David see evil, right and wrong, in the story that Nathan told him, and burn with anger and seem okay with what he had done? And the answer is, he was blind to it. He was selfish. His own selfish desires made what he did seem okay and justified. And he could see it when somebody else did it, and the story was told in a neutral way. But when he was in the middle of it, he didn't see it. And let me just propose to you that what that means is oftentimes we are biased by our own selfish desires, and we have trouble seeing. We convince ourselves that things are right that aren't right, that things are okay when they're dead wrong. And we need to recognize that, because if we have those blind spots, what that means is we need people in our lives who can look at the situation in a neutral way. And when they tell us, we need to listen to them, because how often do we not listen to them and say, oh, they just don't want me to have fun, oh, they're just boring, oh, they just don't trust me, they think I'm going to do this and I'm not really going to do this. Or when really the advice we were given was sound advice, good solid advice. Stay away from that. Don't go, I can see this, you seem blind to it right now, listen to me. But I watch over and over people not listen to trusted spiritual advisors, and because they believe that they know better, because they believe we've been there, right? Because we believe we know better, because we believe that we're stronger and we're not going to fall into that thing like they think we are. And we need to stop being so arrogant and listen to other people. Everybody that tells you something you don't like to hear isn't evil and trying to hurt you. Many people that tell you something you don't want to hear are out for your good and see something that you can't see because you're blinded by your own selfishness, by your own blind spots. Second part, is it possible that you need people in your life to speak truth into your life and help you recognize right from wrong when you have blind spots caused by selfish motives? It's not only possible, it's likely. You need people like this in your life. You need a Nathan in your life before you go and do the wrong thing. You need him to be talking to you. You need to be asking for advice and counsel before you go off and do wrong. So Nathan's not coming in to bring correction and judgment from God. And I need that. So let's seek it out, and then let's listen to it when it comes. Let's stop ignoring it and thinking we're smarter and we know better. Number 6, what, according to 12, 11, and 12, was part of the consequences of David's action. So in 11 and 12, it says, out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I said this already, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you. This is part of the consequences. And there's more consequences. That's all David needs to hear. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. This is where David is different. David is not different because he does everything right, but David is different from Saul and from many of the people that we read about, because David, when he heard this, was broken and said, I have sinned against the Lord. That's how David responded. How do we respond when we are corrected? Number 7 says, what did Nathan say in 12, 13b, and 14? So he says, Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. So A, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. B, but there are still consequences to your sin, and they haven't all been taken away. The son born to you will die. And obviously I added in some explanation, but this is something we need to understand, that just because God forgives sin doesn't mean he takes away every consequence of sin. And we need to understand that, because those of us who think that God's forgiveness and grace being available gives us license to sin don't understand the evil consequences, the consequences of our sin that remain even after we've been forgiven are significant and are more than we want to bear. And we should not take that lightly, because those consequences, God doesn't just remove every consequence of sin. If he did, we'd probably think it was no big deal and we'd keep going. He saves us, he delivers us, he takes away the sin, the death that is ultimately the wages of sin. And yet He doesn't take away every consequence. So we need to recognize that we don't want those consequences remaining. So we need to do everything that we can to live in obedience to God and not take that sin lightly, because God doesn't take it lightly. The last part says, does God's forgiveness always take away all the consequences of our sin? And the answer is no. God forgives us. He might deliver us from ultimate death in hell, but he does not take away every consequence of our sin. And that's important to know, because those consequences can be far reaching for our family. And you know, I've said this many times. A good example is, you know, how many people give their lives to Christ in prison? A lot of people. Prison ministries do great. Some of those people don't continue to follow the Lord after they get out of prison, unfortunately, because when you're in the midst of the consequences of what you've done, it's really easy to be sorry, because you see the consequences. Once you think you're free, you have a tendency to forget those consequences and not really want to and forget how forget the connection between how you got there and what those consequences were. And so then too many of us go right back into it, perhaps don't even realize that the things that we talked about last week, that David's sin didn't start with one bad decision. It started with one bad decision, but that wasn't the last. There were multiple bad decisions that first put him in the position to be tempted badly in a difficult situation. Then he fell into that. Then he tried to cover it up, and it was a series of bad decisions. And most of the time, the first couple are easy to justify and say, we don't think this is that bad. And that's the problem, is we go back into lives. If we've been in prison, we think, well, I won't do this anymore, but we don't realize that these other three things that we're doing are the things that led us to that to begin with. So if we don't get rid of these two, we head down this path again. Anyway, but when we go to give our lives to Christ in prison, the warden doesn't just let us out. The courts don't just let us out. Oh, you're a Christian? Okay, you can go free. Now, if there's a period of good behavior, they may let us out early, perhaps, but we don't just get out because we gave our lives to Christ. There are still consequences for sin, for instance, in those cases. And I would say that's the easiest way to see it. But there are consequences for all sin. Some of those consequences are not as easy to see, but we need to recognize them, because in David's case, the consequences of sin that didn't go away when he repented were significant. If you've lost a child, or you can even imagine losing a child, that is an awful, terrible consequence of sin. And yet he still had to endure that. So we need to take seriously the consequences of sin.